His new book, In the House Un-American, published by Clock Group Books, is partly guided by the metaphor of translation as transport, as the perpetual crossing and metamorphosis of an immigrant's language, identity, and culture. David Shapiro has called it so America, so like an inner emigration, as if we had all changed names. In the mestizo trickster figure of Carlos Ben Carlos Rossman, a Puerto Rican Jew with roots in Leipzig in the Middle East, Hollander has brought to New York Harbor the wannabe heir to the American poet William Carlos Williams' crossbreeding with the immigrant protagonist Carl Rossman of Franz Kafka's America. Carlos's journey, as the critic Joe Safdie writes, is, quote, away from the clear and polemically American language into a more diverse, clashing and cosmopolitan vision, which can create another real world from the facts on the ground as we could know them. A political allegory emerges which unhouses the facts on the American ground by projecting them into fables in the air, where, as Charles Olson wrote, if you burn the facts long enough in yourself as crucible, you'll come to the few facts that matter, and then fact can become fable again. This translation, fact to fable, becomes a visionary landscape for Americans to learn from those who have lived in the un-American house. In the process, a text shape shifts from one form and genre to another, composed in the language of an un-American who tries to sound a native's linguistic fluency, which ends up being translated and distorted by alien frequencies. A text takes shape which is a translation from no original, since origins here, in terms of language and culture and identity, are multiple and varied and subject to translation's tendency to be a sign of betrayal and misunderstanding. Please help me in welcoming Benjamin Hollander.
Thank you, Cole. So I'm going to read from this book, In the House Un-American. Sometimes do this exercise if anybody is from New York, which is where I grew up in Queens, in Jamaica. These two little boys are my brother and I, and we're facing something. And I don't know if anybody can see it, but can anyone guess what we're facing? It happens to be the Statue of Liberty, right? And it's in 1961, but we arrived in 1958, so it took us 3 years to get off the boat. So we're looking at the Statue of Liberty, and my brother, this is almost like, from my perspective, it's two diametrically opposed perspectives, almost like what Ammiel Alcalay called a pes-optimist perspective, where the young boy is looking there with this naive optimism, and the other one's looking at the statue and saying, it's not big enough, I'm not impressed at all. Okay. So I wrote this book, I think the genesis of this book started, I think when we were at Kelly Writer's house, pretty much. When I started thinking to myself, what would it mean to write a book in which I, as someone who came to this country at the age of 6, would write about what it meant to be not American, but to be un-American, and not even have that political consciousness of the Un-American Activities Committee in mind, but just in terms of what would it mean to be American in the sense of fighting your writing identity, your poetic identity, particularly at a time when I grew up, when we were under the sway of William Carlos Williams, okay, a lot of people. And so here's the iconic American poet, and someone like me comes along and says, I have nothing in common with this poet. This book, as Cole was saying, has these figures in it. Carlos Ben Carlos Rossman, who's a Puerto Rican Jew from the Middle East, who is a wannabe William Carlos Williams, and who is kind of a cross between Williams and Carl Rossman. And Williams comes up quite a lot in the book. So I'm going to read a few pieces where he comes up. I should say that a friend of mine who I gave this manuscript to, I asked, is the manuscript clear? And he knew of this mestizo figure who would be very comfortable speaking Spanglish, actually. And my friend wrote me, I asked him if it was clear and if it was, humorous. He said, eso es some pretty hilarious caca right there, hombre. Still, a pesar del constante cambio de language y forma, still it's constant despite the change of language and forms. It's not only clear, but en el espíritu lúdico de Cervantes himself, in the playful spirit of Cervantes himself. So here is Carlos thinking through what it means to have William Carlos Williams as a kind of imaginary relative. And he's talking to this American about the American's father, who was a real pragmatist. Among William Williams and the Puerto Ricans, that's the other thing, when I was growing up, William Carlos Williams, there was no sense that there was a Puerto Rican in William Carlos Williams. He was the iconic American poet, and nobody even, as far as I knew, saw the Carlos in there. And I grew up in a pretty Puerto Rican neighborhood, and nobody knew this was the case. So this starts off, among William Williams and the Puerto Ricans, Carlos talked to Dennis about Dennis's father, who was a 1950s American hydraulic engineer, and needed to know that when you worked, you produced. He had no truck with a nation of counterfeiters and confidence men who waited for you to buy into a promise, speculators who had shaped one vision of the history of the Republic in what Herman had called the Wall Street spirit. He would barter if he thought what you offered him reflected the value of what he offered you. Dennis's parents ran a dry goods store, textiles and buttons and hats, which Carlos heard as a dried goods store, imagining a surplus of old raisins and apricots, sacks of flour, not knowing what this kind of store stood for in an American's Benson shop. His father, Dennis said, learned early. If there was a wheelbarrow in the yard, in the back of the store, and he could go a day without moving supplies in it, he would exchange it for an offer of a chicken, if the offer of a chicken came his way, and if, of course, he needed the eggs for his family. Would he, Carlos asked Dennis, accept a poem? Well, he didn't read much of poetry, but when he did, he could get to like it, his son told Carlos. So what if I walked in with a copy of William Carlos Williams' poem, The Red Wheelbarrow, which begins, so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow? Well, the son said, it depends. If it was the poem William Carlos Williams had written, he'd take it, but not if you signed off on it. So this, I'm going to go from this piece to read from this section in the book called Facts on the Ground, where again Williams comes up. Part of this book involves, as I was saying this afternoon with Ammiel when we did the practicum, taking political facts on the ground, whether they're in America or in Israel, and tweaking them a little so that the rhetoric of those facts that we've heard can be transformed through whatever story I'm telling in the imagination, so that a different reality is kind of created on the ground rather than what we know of. So this is the opening statement to that, and there's a little nod to Ammiel's little history. To those whose memory may not go back to the events of 1917, a little history might help. Today these events would be called facts on the ground. It comes to be what we live with in the wake of what we think and talk through in the abstract. At times these facts are anticipated. At times they are built slowly, like Israeli settlements, over time, and usually no one notices, or more to the point, the rhetoric in the air distracts from the scene so that no one acts in time to stop them, so tension builds until the ground swells and the bodies are suddenly bloated, or as one later lyric laid bare to recall it, the mustard gas laying down the noble dead at Verdun. Enough for us to ask, as if of ghosts, where did all these dead neighbors in the world come from all of a sudden? So that we return in memory and speech across the ground where no one passed, no pasarán, since a return to civil discourse is what is wanted at this time in history. And to those whose memory may not go back to the events of 1933, here Hitler is not the issue. To the election of James Conant as head of the Harvard College, formerly Captain Conant the Younger, as he was called in 1916, and who at the time, upon meeting Fritz Haber the Elder in the city of Leipzig, one chemist to another, with much to think and talk through, listening to each other with interest as they spoke their poison gaseous inventions, with nothing but their thoughts in the air, as though they did not even have to be there in time among the facts on the ground. One later lyric laid bare to recall it, the mustard gas laying down the noble dead. And to those whose memory may not go back to the events of 1946, 1947, who may not even remember, even further back, how the progressive science of the first days of aircraft bombing had progressed just a bit too far into the humanities, who have no time to care or to distinguish who the Americans and un-Americans among us were in 1946, 1947, are maybe a bit puzzled, a bit young. Students may wonder, why am I here? Of what use is a liberal arts education in the 21st century? I have what it is an old letter from Carlos Ben Carlos Rosman, who was once given the facts straight up through his namesake, the good Dr. Carlos Williams, quote, "A little history, a little Shakespeare," he said, "never hurt anyone." Or, put another way, first you are liberalized, then you are professionalized, which sounded like a plan, to be sure, to be pure, sounded a bit like electroshock therapy for the deeply studied, whose memory may not go back. The good doctor was good with advice, William Carlos Williams. Once he told Anglo the Younger, "Son, though there is a desire on the part of the highly organized man to breed with peasant girls, remember, if you do, we will abandon you to America, where much will be expected of you, and where you should know certain vastly important strains of men may die out due to the lack of the penetration of their highly specialized reproductive material into adequate receptors, unless we screw each other over and over until you should be warned, the pure products of America go crazy." So the next section, Facts on the Ground, begins with a quote from Charles Olson, who in this book becomes Carl Olson, okay. And the quote is, "I think if you burn the facts long and harden yourself as crucible," this is, I think, the letter to the anthropologist, Ruth Benedict, right? "I think if you burn the facts long and harden yourself as crucible, you'll come to the few facts that matter, and then fact can become fable again." And then the biographer and translator, you know, how many people know this guy, Robert Payne, translated, hundreds, wrote, I don't know how many biographies of people, Nazi Tongue and Hitler, and, and was a translator. And a very interesting statement in a book called A Report on America, which was, America was fable before it became fact. So I take that idea of how do you take the facts on the ground and make them fabulous on one level and try to create a new reality. So here's a piece about Israel, where Carlos comes into it, Hannah Arendt comes into it, Alexis de Tocqueville come into it, everybody's in it. Anyway, it's called Carlos Ben Carlos Plays Badminton Upstate While Dreaming of the American Unprecedented Conditions of Equality Down Under in the so-called Jewish state. Badminton birdies, like clowns' noses, flip freely in midair over the whited bungalows in Ellenville, New York. And when they landed, Hannah turned to Carlos and remembered what Alexis had imagined at the birth of the alien republic. Hannah asked, "What happens to us under the unprecedented conditions of equality?" Carlos looked mute. So she asked again, differently, "What fables do we come to remember from the facts on the ground?" In his muteness, dust in the air and a flowering desert on his mind, Carlos remembered how one country could become fabled depending on how it used the facts of another. If it desired, Israel, the so-called Greater Judea and Samaria, could become America, or at least New York, which was the most the average Greater Judean and Samaritan knew anyway of America. I love New York. I just came back from there, just like here in Tel Aviv, but without the wars, without the fear, Guy, the teenage boy, had said, and which was the most the average Israeli wanted, like pizza. New York without the fear? He mumbled in disbelief. Before 9/11, Carlos poorly remembered, it used to be only the people upstate where the flags flew high over the porches who were afraid of coming into the big city. And he asked himself in his memory how many New Yorkers really saw themselves as Americans back then, and how many proudly claimed to be un-American in order to distinguish themselves from Iowans or Texans, the way Iowans and Texans distinguish themselves from New Yorkers. The fact was, no one these days remembered this vision of New York outside America, and it was only when the fear arrived that the flags came to distinguish the island. Yeah, well, let's do the math, Carlos thought, and see if it's possible for one land, Israel, to become fabled from the facts of another, its idol, America. Carlos thought, if 10% of New Yorkers are Jews, citizens of the American Republic, and 14% of Israelis are Muslims who are citizens of the Jewish state, often in America called the 51st state, then what do these comparable numbers tell us, Carlos asked himself, about how, in becoming like America, Israel could be free, mathematically? Your analogies are lazy and imperfect, he overheard. They will never work out in the real world among the facts on the ground as we know them, which is why Carlos thought we needed to create another real world from the facts on the ground as we could know them. America, he had heard, wherever its dream migrated, was what you made of it, and he wanted to make something of it. He remembered that in 1958, when the family had first landed, his mother would ignore the crosses on the different steeples, shy away from them on their walks, or more to the point, skulk in the shadows of their towering presence, until later that evening she bent to light a menorah privately in her home. She wanted no one to notice the lighting. But years after they landed in the mothership, during Hanukkah, Carlos reflected on his friend Hannah's different, more 21st century experience, when she witnessed the fabled menorahs in New York City pave the streets, lighting them as if with gifts of gold. They showcased the night windows of Pakistani restaurants in Midtown. They were tucked away in corner spaces among boxes of fried plantains in Chinese Cuban delis. They graced the ticket grills at Grand Central Station. They appeared over the metal detectors inside the Queens County Courthouse and across the street in the blue-tinted windows of the Columbian Bales bondsman. They knew enough not to compete with Christmas trees so much as condition individuals to the demands of society, so Hannah once said, to make a home for 10% of the people, as if they were just a given no one needed to remind anyone of. Even if their initial appearances in the non-Jewish world were just good for business or marketing relations, even if that's why they replicated and started to shine on the streets of the metropolis, so be it. In a future time, the city would look bare in winter without them. This electric, one would not even need to say religious light, present in the mass luminosity of spirit the objects reflected, objects no one even noticed were present. And that was the point. In the 21st century, no one even noticed they were present. Only the mass luminosity of the spirits they reflected. Carlos thought, it is my lonely American dream to reinvent the Jewish state from the American family. The birdies landed, the flags flew only upstate. He thought about his friend Ismail from Palestine, who once said he didn't want to die as just another number on the streets of New York. Yes, exactly, Ismail said. I think I know where you're going. Do you? Carlos asked. You want to know the Islamic object equivalent to the menorah. In as many years as it took the occluded menorah to come across the block and light the streets of New York, we could, Carlos suggested to Ismail, offer the Ramadan fanus, the oil-lit lantern, to any city in the so-called Jewish state, to all the shops, hang them in the kitchens of the Chinese restaurants whose chefs knew enough about doing good business to accommodate the taste of the natives by oversalting the wonton and the egg rolls, display them in the windows of the homes of the Thai guest workers, in the Jewish nursing homes, commanded by Russian arrivals, ministered and absorbed as de facto citizens and pseudo-Jews before they started overcrowding the once empty monasteries of the north, in the bakeries blessed by the rabbis, in Swiss boutiques on the Merkaz. We could come to light the Ramadan fanus, the oil-lit lantern here in its multiple appearances, Carlos thought, as in New York they lighted the menorah wherever it could be found in its multiple appearances. We could be free in the so-called Jewish state, like the people were in America, in New York, to be New York without the fear, like a gift, as if the fear of the state were no longer present. So we were talking earlier about, so here's just a very short one. Call these like thought experiments. Carlos is in Israeli passport control with his American and Israeli passport. Carlos smiles like Uncle Herman in passport control. In Greater Judea and Samaria, across the speech grill, Carlos shows his American passport and is asked by the grim and dour security girl, "What is the purpose of your visit?" Carlos says, "I am a pilgrim, come to bring the Arab Spring." So we talked earlier today about how difference is normalized at times. There's this wonderful quote by Hannah Arendt. In which she speaks to that, and where she basically says well, I'll read part of the quote. She says, "This perversion of equality from a political into a social concept is all the more dangerous when the society leaves but little space for special groups and individuals, for then their differences become all the more conspicuous." And there's a wonderful proverb from the Amish, which reads, "People laugh at us because we're different, we smile at them because they're the same." So this is a piece called Hannah. Carlos and Hannah overthink the ethnic divide. Carlos telepaths Hannah from the mothership. To impress Santorini, I think that these American Santorini is the owner of a cafe in San Francisco. To impress Santorini, I think these American tourists are making themselves sound different, describing themselves as they would fashionable breeds of dog. You know, one of them adoringly faces him when she says this. "I have a bit of Scotch and Indian and French in me," as her friend chimes in, "Yeah, I've got some Italian in me too," as if the two of them have been around the global box, their bodies transported to the Scotch and Indian and French pastorals of the world. Although I think my guess is they have never forgone the exclamatory spirit of the suburbs where they are from. This is the trouble, Hannah thinks, with the Americans' focus on the pride of the ethnic divide, the hyphenated American. It makes some of the least visible and longest mainstays of the American diverse, Scottish American, German American, Swedish American, claim themselves now as the world come to America yet again, as if they were forgotten reflections of today's arrivants. The newfound American digs into his own won-over self and finds that the inviting nature of the nation offers him the right to imbibe this sovereign worldly feeling of the multitudes like a mixed drink with a little bit of this and a little bit of that in him. So Hannah thinks, of course, after everyone's been drinking, it all feels right. Everyone seems different and welcome, and equality, like a family's choice of suburbs, becomes a mundane fact in itself. This is called another fact on the ground that I saw in near, was it 2000, Bush Gore election? Yeah. And its aftermath and the response to that, and the aftermath to the response of the Iranian election in 2009. So this is called Mr. Obama's Fable for Iran's America. And it's Carlos speaking to his mechanic, Abbas, who's from Iran. President Barack Hussein Obama should have listened to Abbas, Carlos's gas station mechanic. How curious you Americans are, Abbas said. Iran has an election, and it is contested, and then hundreds of thousands of the veiled and unveiled throngs in Tehran come out in protest in the streets. And America says, why won't their supreme leaders listen to these people who want freedom like we have it here in America? And Abbas, like a human gin wheel, turns on a dime and says, this is hard to hear this like we have it here in America, because only a few years earlier, in a contested election in Florida, your own supreme leaders make a decision for Mr. Bush, and then no one shows up in the streets of Florida. Why not? And it's enough for little Mr. Gore, the loser, to face the camera conceding, for everyone to just, well, they go away, they go home. This should not have been my story, Abbas says to Carlos. This should have been Mr. Obama speaking from his bully pulpit, the rumor of a fable from the facts on the ground in Tehran. Obama's Iranian vision of what is possible in protest for Mr. Gore and the people of America when they don't just quit and go home, and for their supreme leaders This should have been, Abbas says, his squeaky wheel getting us all to grease. And I'm going to, are we okay on time? Yeah. I'm going to conclude with this piece called Just Call Me Al. It kind of riffs on this Depression era song, Brother Can You Spare a Dime? There's a line in there. So Just Call Me Al, riffs on a story by Ray Lardner, and then also on a Paul Simon song, You Can Call Me Al. And it's a piece in which Carlos, the primary figure, tries to reinvent what it means to be American, meaning to figure out how to be non-tribal. You know? And the tension here is between a tribal nation, or a nation that has a tribal spirit, as opposed to a nation that has a universalist spirit. And so I'm just going to read excerpts from it. It's one long piece, but it really is hard to excerpt, but I'll try. And it begins with a quote from Herman Melville, who in this text is Uncle Herman of Redburn. And it goes, "We are not a narrow tribe of men with a bigoted Hebrew nationality whose blood has been debased in the attempt to ennoble it by maintaining an exclusive succession among ourselves. No, our blood is as the flood of the Amazon, made up of 1,000 noble currents, all pouring into one. We are not a nation so much as a world, for unless we may claim all the world for our sire, we are without father or mother. For who was our father and our mother? Or can we point to any Romulus and Remus for our founders? Our ancestry is lost in the universal paternity, and Caesar and Alfred, St. Paul and Luther and Homer and Shakespeare are as much ours as Washington, who is as much the world's as our own." So this is the section 4, which kind of pits the meaning of tribal survival versus universalist spirit. It was this way of tribal survival in this America which moved Carlos to thinking about Ismael's Aunt Alice, she of the liberally infringed Jewish community of D.C. or NYC or the state of Oklahoma, where she was really from. It didn't matter, since all liberally infringed Alices of America still identified as pro-Israel, believing they could agree with it or not, be pro-life and pro-choice, never wanting to look dead set against it in order to appear worldly, open, as long as it could survive as is, even if as is was dead set against others whom it walled in and whose land it occupied. "We are not a narrow tribe of men," Uncle Herman could be heard saying in the background. And as Alice felt this to be true, Carlos felt the deep irony which undercut it and which unfolded one evening after supper when Alice sat down in the American suburbs with her converted to Islam niece, who asked her, "Mother, is Judaism? In what do you believe?" Alice stopped, a bit startled, but regaining her confidence said, "This is what's so wonderful about Judaism. We are flexible in our beliefs. There are different kinds of Jews. We are not fixed in our beliefs. This is how we have arrived in different lands and survived for 3,000 years." And was disappointed when her once Jewish niece said, "That's interesting, but in Islam, we like to give our kids a foundation in belief." As the verse, "The faithful are to one another like parts of a building, each part strengthening the others," came to her, which her aunt found strange. But why? Because it was true. To be a Jew was, well, to be an American. One could invent oneself. In America, Carlos thought, you could just call me Al, or Alice, or Allah, or be queued to the bees for Buddha. It didn't matter. You could move yourself from house to house, person to person, belief to belief. If one foundation in God without graven images crumbled, you could erect forbidden idols without a God in another. Jews, for example, Jewboos, East Coast pilgrims gone west, who had turned to Buddhism for the soul of Judaism. Carlos had often heard the so-called flexibility theory bandied about by relatives. It could make them into super global Buddhists able to venture outside the ghetto walls, albeit with a stash of mini Buddha statues in their satchels. And venture outside the ghetto walls they did, even as the Alices among them clung to the state of the Jews. But Carlos felt the fear in Alice's response. She was scared for her niece, for whom she thought Islam had become, in a strange twist of historical fate, the very return to what the Jews had ditched in the ghetto when they bettered themselves in America. She worried visions of Burkahood upon her niece's personhood. Your ancestors came from Poland to America not to be shot in the ghetto. Carlos remembered his own mother's warning of a different time as he thought about Alice's fear for hers. The ancestors had come to America to leave all that. At least this is what Carlos and Alice had heard from their uncles. But if Uncle Herman of Redburn was right, and America was not a narrow tribe of men, if we were not a nation so much as a world, and if Uncle Leopold of Lahore left the Judaic path for the road to Mecca because it was too tribal, that is, intended for the people of Israel who needed to maintain an exclusive succession among themselves, then Carlos ben Carlos Rossman could only guess the secret no one would confess, and which would put an end to Alice's dream, and which she never saw coming, that like a racetrack gambler, she had placed her fear on the wrong horse of a faith, so to speak, with the great secret being only that the heart of Islam was American, and that there was nothing to fear. So Carlos discovers that this conflict between Islam and the West is based more on the similarity in their values than their difference. In other words, one culture challenging another, and wants to know where he fits into that. So he says, my name is Carlos ben Carlos Rossman. I am Puerto Rican and Jewish. I have 3 names stature in the Americas. I am the wannabe heir to the American poet William Carlos Williams, who, let's face it, without my name would be nothing special. It would be the same thing over and over again, like a William Williams, who does not know I am relative to the emigrant Carlos, a poor and friendless son of earth, who has, like Uncle Herman of Redburn's America, no sire, and on life's ocean was swept along as spoon drift in a gale. And Carlos asked, what on earth was spoon drift in a gale? Where could it be found? Until he realized it had been blown off the water in the air across Ocean Highway and into his eyes, and then saw he was drifting on the beach inside its amassing mist, and in a move recalling the words of Uncle Herman of Redburn, somewhere between a stranger holding a slate which read, charity thinketh no evil, and the stranger's enemy posting a slate which read, no trust. Carlos wrote the damp note to himself, as if an idea was spinning like a gin wheel inside the words. No ideas, but in the words. The heart of Islam is American. And beside himself wondered how its foundation would be peopled, asking, but who? Where drones bury in sand the faithful's houses, where Marines piss on Taliban corpses, where Qurans are matchlit monthly by the infidel occupiers, where villages are assassinated by lone American soldiers, who, if I post it, if the social media machine tablets take my message for the mass of people peering down at their palms at bus stops when it's not raining, who will believe the heart of Islam is American? How do I post it when no one believes in posters anymore? And who among the Americans, upon receiving the message, and what if they receive it in the rain when for some reason no one ever looks down at their machine palms at bus stops, will have faith in a religion which is so close to them, yet threatens them? Or as Hannah once revealed about the acts of the founding fathers, will plead for some religious sanction at the very moment when they are about to emancipate the secular realm fully from the influences of the churches and to separate politics and religion once and for all. And then, beside himself, like one of the mute human monuments of that 18th century orator of mankind, Anarchastus Cloots, who believed that our ambassador titles are not written on parchment, but on the living hearts of all men, Carlos, the 21st century Cloots disciple, stumbled into the Foreigners Committee as if he were heir to the vagrants of the world collected by Cloots at the world's cafes when he was diving down insidious, obscure in the great deep of Paris in order to make the thought of the Jean man a fact on the ground among the stragglers, the peg-legged Peggies and Betties, among the disappeared ones like Carlos's cousin Carl Russman, who had applied for work and stature in Kay's America and then self-identified as a lynched Negro in native Jim Thorpe's home in Prague, Oklahoma, bringing the and Fox Nation boy, stripped of his gold medals in 1913, 2 days after his wannabe Bubala cousin Kachek aborted the scribing of Oklahoma in America among the whispered Polacks, long flowing turbaned Ishmaelites, astrological Chaldeans, mute representatives of their tongue-tied, befettered, heavy-laden nations, wanting their place in the American Universal Republic, coming to it like the long-flowing Turk, or like Carlos Ben Carlos Rosman himself with his imperfect knowledge of the native dialect, his words like spilt water, the thought he had in him remaining conjectural to this day, so that he ceased making a sound in an America which had always been a rhetoric of riches beyond him, which gagged him as a child when he lugged his green, yes, his green baseball bat through the tunnels of what his father called in conversation the Yankee Stadium, somewhat the way the natives would enter into a discussion of the Constitution, not because he knew of its historic uniqueness, but because he had heard the public address announcer, Bob Shepard, call out players in the same isolating way. Now batting for the Yankees, the center fielder, number 7, Mickey Mantle. So why not call the player out in the Yankee Stadium as if together in the stadium they could be in the republic for which it stands, Carlos's father thought, and then eyeing his son, who was befuddled with the hot dog in one small hand, told him to put the other over his heart as they both sang something to the one nation under God. You must sing something to the one nation under God now, his father said as the band played, and Carlos wondered but said nothing. What was the significance of the hand over the heart versus the mute hand salute to the temple, which he had seen focused, uniformed men perform around the Kennedy coffins on the television? Why one and not the other before the players took the field? Did Bob Shepard know? Did his father know? Did anyone know the American history Uncle Eugen would later pass down to Carlos, that a dead silence prevailed when the word nation was first adopted by Congress? The British nation could as little be replaced by an American nation as the king could be replaced by Congress. And in contrast to how Carlos's father had never heard the word happiness in Europe, so that Hannah had to claim it as a fable in America, the word nation, so Uncle Eugen had told Carlos, was heard everywhere, yet was one of those artificial words of European coinage that swam on the surface of America's political talk, as if no one really believed it, like a conviction too abstract to speak, as if it only stood in for the republic it used to be. Carlos never imagined this as he sat with his father in the third tier of the stadium. He didn't even know it was the first park in baseball history to be no park, no field, to be between the no longer and the not yet, augmented, a stadium following the Greek stadia, and the fat guy behind him breathed Cubans down Carlos's neck, noise down his neck with the words, "Come on, Big Ears," referring to Don Big Ears Mossy, the Tigers pitcher, who was facing the Yankees center fielder Mickey Mantle, while the Tigers' Alcalay, resembling in Carlos's mind the youthful Del Schaffner from the New York football Giants, stood swatting flies in Babe Ruth's spot in right field. Years later, Carlos saw himself in the stands, Mossy facing Mantle, Alcalay resembling Del Schaffner or Del Shannon. You could just call him Al or Del or Allah of the Americas, all welcomed. And the boy Carlos coming to the beginning of the land from the outside, from up on top, breathing in smoke, looking down on Monument Park, where the first Yankees were memorialized and enshrined after 1929 in center field. But was this meant to be the house that Ruth or Klutz built? Carlos wondered years later. Well, Ruth had more staying power and clout, but Klutz, like Carlos, the 21st century Klutz disciple, had the immigrant vagrant's dream and a green baseball bat to boot to bring with him into the house. It was something Carlos never wondered about at game time. Was the house meant to be the exclusive ground for Ruthian tribal Yankees idols, or could it sell itself for all, as if it were the Klutzian universal American republic of non-dualistic Buddhist bobbleheads standing in their oneness for those buried in the Monument Park in center field? What could they be out there, these stone legends? On what foundation would America rest What principle, what beginning, principium, would one surrender oneself to? What companions? Was it a self-surrender, Islam, to a foundation constantly increased, like a stadium renovated over time, reconstituted on values of distinct eras? We claim to stand there, the genre humain, as mute monuments, Anarchassus wrote, where in the monument park in center field, the house that Ruth built could meet the house that Cruz built in a vision which for Carlos Ben Carlos Rossman meant that the heart of Islam could be American from the start, and that like the Yankee Stadium and the Constitution for which it stood, it could be worshipped among all the pilgrims who Aunt Hannah had remarked could be blind and undiscriminating because its origins would not be shrouded in the halo of time and could be seen from the stands or from wherever they stood when they first arrived on the mothership as the arrivant, at any moment seeing across time and space mute statues and upstanding citizens anchored in the harbor of the New York of the new land, while Aunt Hannah was writing missives home. Dear mothership, Carlos and I, we are here now a while, and Carlos has discovered the strange possibility that the Americans have the capacity to blindly stumble into a future where they will declare in the light of reason that the heart of Islam is American. In fact, he is convinced that they could even trace this apparent sacrilege to the founders' declarations. In the meantime, Uncle Herman has confided in us that our happiness is self-evident, and as such, beyond reason and divinely informed. If we are given freedom of choice, he tells us, we may force or not force the smile he calls the chosen vehicle of all ambiguities. As it pleases us, so we smile. As it is, we are appearing to have our fill of it among the Americans who can't help but have their fun and say that it's all good. And as it is, we see that there is a great good fortune which always smiles upon them in their blindness and in their confidence, and that they are often filled with happiness, and that they have this extraordinary capacity to look upon yesterday with the eyes of centuries to come. Thank you.
And I'm going to introduce you while you make a fashionable exit and return. Okay, that's a little strange, right, to announce someone who's absent? Yeah. Should I wait? Or should I actually take this opportunity to say what I really think?
Yeah, you can see it on tape.
No, I'll stick to the book. Poet, novelist, critic, and scholar Ammiel Alcalay has been publishing translations from a number of languages for over 30 years. As an advocate of writing from various parts of the world, particularly the Middle East and the Balkans, he has been instrumental in forging a space for engaged political encounters with other cultures and languages. He has remained critical of various consumer models that present other parts of the world as legs along an imperial tourist package, and skeptical of facile exchanges that obfuscate the role of U.S. policies in creating linguistic, economic, political, and aesthetic deficits and imbalances. After several decades of immersion in projects centered in and on other regions, Alcalay has re-entered the room and has put most of his efforts back into comprehending the context of how one uses American English and what that might mean for a reconfiguration of post-Second World War American culture. Given that 1/3 of the world's languages were indigenous to the Americas prior to conquest and colonization, and that this is the only continent that has been fully dispossessed, with not one country officially speaking a native language, Alcalay has been exploring new approaches to North American political, cultural, and literary history. Taking on the one hand Mesoamerican scholar Gordon Brotherston's crucial idea that the prime function of classical texts is to construct political space and anchor historical continuity, and poet Charles Olson's idea that the history of these states remains unrelieved as starting points, Alcalay has taken his experiences as a translator into realms that have little to do with the prevailing discourse in which literary translation has become embedded. This semester, Alcalay has been teaching a graduate seminar that is clearing further space to imagine how we might think about U.S. culture differently. 1944 sees Aimé Césaire write Poetry and Knowledge, and Robert Duncan publish The Homosexual in Society. Jack Kerouac, a working-class French-Canadian whose mother tongue is Joual, and who comes to be considered Quebec's first post-colonial writer, meets Allen Ginsberg. Charles Olson, also from the working class, resigns from the Roosevelt administration as U.S. policy changes begin absorbing Nazis and war criminals into official policy-making positions. In the face of colonialism, death camps, and nuclear bombs, feeling, intuition, and experience become new forms of knowledge whose poetics create completely unaffiliated frameworks and networks of understanding. Ammiel has also been teaching an MFA course in translation with readings ranging from Eric Havelock's Preface to Plato, Aristotle's Poetics, and Longinus's On the Sublime, to the Popol Vuh, The Performance of Human Rights in Morocco, An Introduction to Arab Poetics by Adonis, and Science in Translation by Scott L. Montgomery. Finally, as initiator and general editor of Lost and Found, the CUNY Poetics Documents Initiative, he has been putting to the test the unrelieved nature of the U.S., along with the idea of a classical text constructing political space and anchoring historical continuity by collaboratively training younger scholars to think through such conceptions as they lay the groundwork through recuperating and editing archival materials for a new American literary and cultural history. Alcalay's latest books are A Little History and the 10th anniversary edition of From the Warring Factions with an introduction by Diane de Prima. The 20th anniversary of his groundbreaking work After Jews and Arabs Remaking Levantine Culture was just celebrated this fall in New York City. Alcalay will read from his work and recount his own trajectories through languages, cultures, forms of writing, scholarship, and political activity. Welcome, Ammiel Alcalay.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Well, I have to fulfill that mandate. Thank you, Nicole. It was something. I thought I would read a few translations to start off, since this was the topic really of today, and kind of writ large. So I'll just start with a couple of things. This is from a book called Keys to the Garden, which came out in 1996, and which Wilson Harris said about a Jew writing in Arabic is not read in Israel. So writes Samir Nakash. Ammiel Alcalay's remarkable selection of text is a plea on behalf of Israeli imaginations in spiritual exile. One is driven to meditate on the genius of truth in every revisionary monument of home. And if anybody knows Wilson Harris's extraordinary work in his text, Quetzalcoatl in the Smoking Mirror, where he has the idea of phantom limbs, he talks about, for instance, how Dante leaves Virgil. He says, well, what does that mean? What is he leaving? How can he leave him like that? What is that? What will that generate or not generate? So he has this idea of how things, that are unfulfilled, or as Olson said, unrelieved, fester, continue to have an existence. So I want to read just a couple of poems here. One is part of in this book, I included photographs of these writers because you had to kind of verify that they existed, because their reality had been put into such question. For instance, in a very popular book that people still teach with, called the Modern Hebrew Poem Itself, there's reference to a poem by this poet Erez Biton, who was born in Algeria and grew up in Morocco, dedicated to a great singer, Zohar al-Fassia. It refers to Zohar al-Fassia, the legendary Moroccan singer, as a fictive character. So this was the poem. Zohra al-Fasiya's song. Singer at Mohammed V's court in Rabat, Morocco. They say when she sang, soldiers fought with knives to clear a path through the crowd, to reach the hem of her skirt, to kiss the tips of her toes, to leave her a piece of silver as a sign of thanks. Zohra al-Fasiya. Now you can find her in Ashkelon, Antiquities 3 by the welfare office, the smell of leftover sardine cans on a wobbly three-legged table, the stunning royal carpet stained on the Jewish agency cot, spending hours in a bathrobe in front of the mirror with cheap makeup. When she says Muhammad sank, apple of our eyes, you don't really get it at first. Zohra al-Fasiya's voice is hoarse, her heart is clear, her eyes are full of love. Zohra al-Fasiya. And just two more short poems. One by a dear friend who died a couple of years ago, a great activist, Tikva Levy. And this is a poem. There's a housing project in Israel called Jesse Cohen, named after. We live in Jesse Cohen. We live in Jesse Cohen in Holon on Zionism Street, for those who know it, sandwiched in by Aharonovich and parallel to Anilyevich, trapped by these names. I have an uncle who lives in the Ben Gurion housing by the graveyard. We moved from Ashkelon, from Zion Heights. Once they just called them projects, before the UN decision equating Zionism with racism. And those who decided on the names never lived in these neighborhoods, but on University Street in Spring Heights. Yet we're inside racism, parallel to Holocaust, awfully close to the graveyard, there in Ashkelon and here in Holon. And these were all names of streets. And this is a poem by an old friend and now colleague, Sami Shalom Shitrit, called Acrid Memory. And it describes a scene during the Gulf War when soldiers were coming back, and he was in New York and watching this, and it reminded him of a war scene of his own. It's called Acrid Memory. At the train station, a rabid crowd doles out yellow ribbons and flags, asking passers-by to pledge their blessings and give thanks to the boys coming home. As for me, I put down miserable, pitiful souls. And a stinging memory comes back, homecoming memory. Driving through the streets of a strange city at full tilt, the streets there weren't at all unfamiliar to us. An old Arab stood by the side of the main road waving his cane. Now I think, that old man's grandfather once must have stood by the side of that very road and waved that very cane. We stopped to find the meaning of his wave. The old man bent toward me. In his eyes I saw that he didn't get the essence of human adulation, the quality of victory or failure, and spit a yellow glob of saliva in my face before turning back on his way. And on that day I was purified, and not just for a fleeting moment was I purified. From that. And I just want to read a few poems by the Bosnian poet Samesdin Mekindinovic, who we talked about a few times earlier. Ben teaches Samesdin all the time, and I'll often get a phone call at an odd hour from his class asking a question about one of these poems. And people, and this is at a community college in California, he was like, who are you calling? What's going on here? This was the first book that actually said, translated from the Bosnian. Corpse. We slowed down at the bridge to watch some dogs hear a corpse apart by the river. And then we went on. Nothing in me has changed. I heard the crunch of snow under tires, like teeth biting into an apple, and felt the wild desire to laugh at you, because you call this place hell, and you flee from here convinced that death outside Sarajevo does not exist. martyr's resting place. A body just about to be buried. I see a soldier on his knees, still a kid. His rifle rests in his lap. You can hear the guttural murmur of Arabic. Sorrow gathers in circles under the eyes. The men pass their open palms across their faces. As the rites continue, I feel the presence of God in everything. When this is over, I will take a pen and make a list of my sins. Now everything in me resists death. As my tongue passes over my teeth, I can sense the taste of a woman's lipstick. No one is crying. I keep quiet. A cat jumps across the shadow of a minaret. And just one more from here. This one we actually read earlier. Ben read this earlier. Dates. He was killed January 17th, 1994. Every day from then on, he's been dead. He's dead today, too. It's Friday, February 24th, 1995. Every day I have a transcendental experience. When I go to the bathroom at night, I notice a shadow rising in the mirror over my left shoulder. It isn't mine. I turn, and what do I see? My eyes open in sleep. A raven has landed on my table and in a human voice says, "Cherries will be ripe in Sarajevo, the 17th of May." I heard, and I'm waiting. And then I just want to read a couple of poems from this really extraordinary book, Nine Alexandrias. Semezin is, I don't know of anybody who came to this country with the experience that he came with and got as intimately involved with how things actually work here, poetically. I don't know of any other instance. I mean, I think you would. Yeah, I can't think of that. And this poem, I think, kind of clinches it, if I can find it. Just give me a second. Well, here's one. Open dialogue. What are you reading? Poems by Jalaluddin Rumi, a poet born in Afghanistan. Where are you from? Bosnia. Serbs and Croats, right? Is anyone else there? There are others. What color are your eyes? Green till Colorado. But since we passed Apache Canyon, they're blue in the New Mexico light. So then, what kind of Muslim are you? White. Yeah, this one. In the garden of a restaurant, a reddish-colored cat stares at tiny creatures in the leaves. Everything is so natural, that is, familiar. We sit around the cast iron table like a real family on an outing. And I think of my father. He was a miner in a coal mine. And I think of my father's father, who was a miner in a salt mine. I think of a black and white family photo from a time that makes me feel something like sorrow and not sorrow. Something from the glint of whose eyes only massive solar panels could make migrate into the language of poetry. I keep brooding as soon as I find a happy picture to amuse me. Mainly I find myself forgetting. I long for beauty when life becomes completely unbearable. Everyone I know is like me. It seems we've come a long way alone in sorrow, only when we're weary, and it's then the grave of every one of us is in Palestine. And one more from this, which I kind of can't help reading because it's dedicated to me. The sun went down right to the gas pumps, then lost itself in the clouds. I'm standing on Telegraph Avenue and looking up. Czeslaw Milosz lives on the hill, and because of him I think of my room in Sarajevo. And I think of that room's bookish utopia. I had wanted to show the symbols of Islam in the light of so-called Western metaphysics. And I wanted to renew the forgotten notion of Jesus, the boy wonder. But it all ends in pure desire. As I'm standing on Telegraph Avenue now, I feel like I'm ready, because there's nothing else I want to possess. Okay, I want to read, see if there's a way to do this. Yeah, I just want to read a couple of pieces. The Cairo Notebooks came out in 1993, and From the Warring Factions begins in 1993 and is finished in August of 2001. And Scrap Metal came out in 2007, and I think of them as a kind of trilogy, but Scrap Metal I think of as kind of a commentary on what preceded it, and a kind of almost fed up commentary, like, you didn't get it? Well, let me try to say this more plainly. So I just want to read a couple of, one of the things that was curious to me, and it took me many years to figure out, was that in the Cairo Notebooks, for instance, there's a reliance on some documentary material, which some of it is torture testimony that I was involved in either taking or translating, and there's a very clear differentiation between that documentary material and a narrator, very clear distinction. And at the same time, there are these very old prose pieces embedded in the text. And I want to just see if I can read through to give you a sense of that mix very briefly. The Cairo Notebooks. Going from the Grand Canal to Lido and seeing St. Mark's Square for the first time, the words, "I hear Arabia calling," kept running through my head over and over again. Like a long-lost amulet, I could finally feel touch me. What if either of them, now that it was over, the mother or her daughter, should appear among the faces that passed before him? He remembered the beginning and the end, but had utterly forgotten how they had moved together in between. Whether he followed he or she him, whether their unpracticed voices had met and locked or ran on disparate, each cushioned by its own drum. Sometimes at night the curtains swayed in the rooms they weren't in, past the hall whose wood and thickly painted walls had been cared for so well. Once he thought her mother wanted him, or he her, a humid, windless night. She lay there before the open window, the curtains limp. He sat on the edge of her bed at ease but unsure, knowing it wasn't far to get water, but not wanting to leave her side, not wanting ever again to jar the stillness the children had never known after the untimely rites, the discreet violence of a life rearranged. The apprehension of the age was in her face, the gray here and there, neither penitent nor defiant, but considered, fully possessed. And if bodily comfort could have been his to give, he would have sunken his face slowly between her legs to make it seem as if it were a dream. But he knew she wasn't quiet, that unleashed to pleasure she would never want to stop, and only by not moving, by fixing the pain above her thick brows in his silence, could he truly provide any. He took his hand and held it to her forehead, letting the tears fall freely. He stroked her hair and gently kissed her eyes. She let her head fall back, her parched lips parted, lost to sleep, more than usual tonight and earlier. But he was so enveloped in her hair that he didn't mind. No sound of steps, no keys, no doors. They would be alone. Did she have men just for the sake of appearance, for that in her that wanted to keep reopening the wound? With him it was different. She knew he accepted the impossibility of it, and that made it all the more treasured. And because it was impossible, she knew he would be tender, knew he could burrow deep into her farthest recesses. She stirred, then turned and curled, pushing her head between his legs. He pressed her close and held her head defiantly like a precious object. Outside the night seemed about to burst, but nothing broke in wake of all the rumbling. The water would be filthy until the end of September, and by then this night would be cherished for its mercy by her companions, also cast off and wary of everything except the need to sift the pieces they had been left to reassemble, day by day, in each other's loving company. A small claim, perhaps, but one at least in which her daughter had a stake. To eliminate blindly at first, but with purpose, what she had no choice but to take as the ultimate cruelty of his silence. Words did different work for them, their lack provoking ire in one, tranquility in the other. If only the limits could be abolished, he thought, as if they never were. If only we could love each other voicelessly and without end, and in my silence find your peace. But it didn't get to that. He had never thought it through that far, though they surpassed this in their being together there, in her head between his legs, in his constant hands holding her so tightly. Her daughter's need to first expel him, to gather up her shards, to probe an even deeper layer and reach a place where tools could be recovered whole, made her afraid that such a bond of kinship in the sole company of women would draw them to a pitch that might prove unendurable. To take him fully and finally, as she sensed she needed to, would be one way to circumvent that, for it would be conclusive and wholly unforgivable. Had indifference driven her so far that nothing else was left her but a retribution so concise and willed it could be carried out on no one other than her only daughter? Was it so long ago that they had borne each other's fears in their knowing hands, held each other's hair, touched each other's lips? But why deny herself? She knew his silence would be perfect, a dolphin gliding through her waters, and she knew she herself was ready not to erupt, to contain everything he was so prepared to give her selflessly. Either way, they would be together till morning. In the dusty thicket, intrepid liberty traps light. I lost the Cairo notebook in Geneva. It had checkered lines and the word yellow was written on it in red letters. Here, in the whirlpool of the city, in the incessant noise of masses of refugees and exiles from different lands and of different races, among sad, displaced peasants in broad blue gowns who had left a homeland not their own to oppressors and blood-sucking landlords, to escape empty-handed to the distant and enchanting city of promise, and to try their fortune there as porters and street cleaners, doormen or pickpockets, here his presence aroused no wonder or astonishment. Daylight never penetrated the room, so a weak electric light was on all day long. To burn the house down with the money in it, to revel in the power of refusing to loot, to strip the soldier of his clothes, put his weapons on the pyre and let him go free, ashamed of his nakedness. Many dozens showed up in the mosques and swore on the Koran that they had abandoned their treasonous ways and were then reaccepted into their communities. The press reported cases in which weapons which were brought by the collaborators were not taken for use by the uprisers, but were publicly destroyed as a symbolic act of purification by means of total separation from items contaminated by the occupation forces. In the name of God, the merciful and compassionate, appeal, 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 appeal number 12, to our sacrificing people, to the mothers of the martyrs and to the mothers of the detainees and the injured. We want to assure the kings and rulers that we don't want their money because we're willing to starve and go naked, but we'll never kneel. Several weeks of heavy dreams, the air itself permeated by silence and the violence beneath it. The camp's war continues. Religious authorities have given residents permission to eat flesh, sea piracy, food and medicine seized, committee meetings, taking testimony, writing accounts, pickets, public discourse admits a breach grinding off to a halting start, rocket stages admit a breach, in the dusty thicket, intrepid liberty traps light. Tomorrow it will be someone even closer, submerged in a return that had begun when? At whom was I angry? When she called to say how good it had been, when it's all alien to me, and the intention of that desire carried by a language that grows out of itself and is the magic of fully living within the mother tongue. Anyone from someplace can feel it. The brutal anonymity, the ripe, the ready, the soft, naked flesh, memory of another time, this crowd, these vistas, not enough noise, excessively punctual. We're going, clippity, to the good, clop, people of Zamalek. The nurses that we met from Sabra and Shatila, happy to be in Gaza. Some people at the vigil had relatives up there. The doctor was quoted as saying 6 people died and she amputated the legs of 7 others gunned down when they rushed to meet the food trucks trying to get in. After all the cats, dogs, mules, and other animals in the camp were eaten, a mother and her 5 children committed suicide to avoid having to turn to cannibalism. In Geneva, all the revolutionaries stayed in 5-star hotels. Tel Aviv, the Ayatollah floats over the central bus station. Textiles, cassettes and tin, posters of Saddam whirl and spin over the River Jordan. Mine eyes have seen the glory. Okay, that's from Cairo Notebooks. So, I don't know. This is really hard to excerpt from. I'll give you a little taste and then just maybe read a few texts from Scrap Metal to wind up. From the Warring Factions is a book-length poem in 5 sections dedicated to the Bosnian town of Srebrenica, where in 1995 there was a massacre of some 7,000 Muslim men and boys. And in this book, except for very brief parts, what I realized was in order to deal with this material, as opposed to in the Cairo Notebooks, everything had to be appropriated. I needed to use other language and have other language involved in, for instance, in the section, I'll read 2 of those poems, in the section that actually specifically deals with Srebrenica, there's 4 poems that end that section, which are all taken from words drawn from Shelley's Revolt of Islam. And one of the reasons why I went to Shelley's Revolt of Islam was it was one of the only English texts that I could think of with the word Islam in it, in any sense. And obviously Shelley's politics played a role, and the idea of Shelley's words speaking to this event seemed kind of important. But so this works very differently than that, in a sense, and I'll just well, actually, it's time. Let me just read you those few poems from the end of that section, because the rest is just very hard to get in clips, and then I'll read a few pieces from Scrap Metal. Well, let me read part of this. I'll skip in this section. The sun and moon in their reckoning, the star in trees bowed low, the kernel in the grain and the fragrant herb, the pear and plum trees so close to the window, like wool dyed and carded, like scattered moths now left to the wild, like inscriptions worn thin on flattened stones, like tamarisks and boulders in the shimmering haze. Love of the ruins inflames not my heart, but the love of those who once inhabited them. Not so much the house, but the roses, they tear me apart. Have you considered the water you drink, the fire you kindle, the birds above spreading their wings and closing them, as if they were the stumps of fallen trees? Because the world was watching, I personally never expected to resist the scheme which commanded us to forget the legendary. It was myself seemed held, and lifting it would be like pouring oil on an already burning fire. At the sound of the cry of the pilots, no stone will be on another stone. In the southern part, it was very strange, a kind of dead silence, for they say the breasts of the free are the graves of secrets. And questions of industry and idleness demonstrate that if we aim our action at the presence of the real and the messages of the unknown events, heroes, and records of the earth, then the sun of witnessing shines down. And if I am like them in the rest, I should resemble them in that, keeping the peace but not enforcing it, to save a town dating back to Roman times. For some reason at those moments you have no brain, you are so obedient that you do just what they tell you. Take the sign down. Do I have to tell you 10 times, get up there and take the sign down? The level of proof has not to be different than any crime committed. Is this for my wife? Yes, for you and your wife. Thank you very much. For days are long they have judged, and they have refused to consider fruitless and sweet the rewards they reject to be worthless. Muddy shoes, a pair of jeans, some moccasins, a piece of wire, and a leather jacket aimed decisively at the point where the religious and social structure is most fragile. We refer here to the women, especially adolescents, and to the children. Don't be afraid. I want to help you. Your people need not die. Just decide what you want to do. No matter if you're old or young, you'll get transport. For whoever is effaced by the real from confirmation is returned to the witnessing of others and affirmed in the ravines of distinction. And some people mean by the moment the time in which a person happens to be. Certainly with hindsight, we would never allow ourselves to be the victims of double dealings. For absence is the absence of the heart from the knowledge of the states that are occurring, due to the preoccupation of the perception with what is coming upon it. The minimum that it can create is that the principle of uncertainty, these people doing what they have done and knowing of our existence. In the days leading up to the tragedy, no one even complained. As they walked toward the gates, they just walked through. In the final analysis, overrun, as part of an overall settlement, the enclave may not have been defensible. His hand on my shoulder, still trembling. To awaken public hope in the tide of human things, which, like an epidemic transport, can unlock with the slightest motion, eat with poisonous rust into the soul, the historical fact from which liberty derives all its recommendations, and falsehood the worst features of its deformity. The faithlessness of tyrants, the massacre and extermination of the patriots, the victory of established power, the consequences of legitimate despotism, civil war, famine, plague, superstition, an utter extinction of the domestic affections, the judicial murder of the advocates of liberty, the treachery and barbarity of hired soldiers. Add war to war, not as an obstacle, but as an instrument of its aims flawed from the beginning. Principle, timeliness, and substance stood in the way, heightening the risk. Images rendered useless blur the distinction, raise unrealistic expectations, exceed the... Say hello to Ibrahim, left behind the prism of moral equivalency. Engage the column in accordance with agreed procedures, holding all the cards, a consensus absent, lacking a strategy, burdened by an unclear mandate, forced to chart its own course, a light option without formed units, a light option with formed units, a heavy option, lift and strike, building on the process in order to promote symbolic deterrence, participate in the delivery, enable force multiplying characteristics, monitor significant blind spots, take stock, and in the absence of fundamental consent, level the killing field and execute the mandate. In some cases, the victims were made to dig their own graves. In others, they were shot while standing in them. It appears that over the course of the next several months, the bodies were taken out of the initial mass graves and reburied in 33 different secondary sites. One survivor later realized that he was walking on blood. Suddenly, like shapes of living stone clothed in the light of dreams, I tore the veil, the shrouds which wrap the world, the frost of death, the flood of tyranny, a paradise of flowers, within which the poor heart loves to keep the earnings of its toil, a common home, stains of inevitable crime, pride built upon oblivion to rule the ages that survive our remains, violence and wrong, an unreturning stream, the grief of many graves, snow and rain on lifeless things. This is not faith or law, opinion more frail, or life poison in its wells, that delights in ruin as endless armies wind in sad procession. The earth springs like an eagle, even as the winds of autumn scatter gold in the dying flame. We learn to steep the bread of slavery in tears of woe. These faded eyes have survived a ruin wide and deep, which can no longer borrow from chance or change what will come within the homeless future. that gold should lose its power and thrones their glory, that love which none may bind be free to fill the world like light whose will has power, when all beside is gone, faint accents far and lost to sense of outward things, some word which none here can gather. Yet the world has seen a type of peace, some sweet and moving scene returning to feed on us, as worms devour those years come and gone like the ship which bears me in this, the winter of the world. Maybe I'll stop there.
Stop. Sure. So we have time, I suppose, for questions or comments and conversation. I don't know if you want to join.
I have a question, no. No, I don't have that.
Yeah.
I have a question regarding especially translating books like the modern Hebrew poem itself. And this goes back to what you were saying earlier today in the other talk, translating across languages, the multilingualism and multiculturalism, where in most modern Hebrew poetry, it relies on biblical Hebrew the way that modern Western poetry relies on the classics.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're translating something like that, how do you reconcile the language of the text with the reader's, the American English-speaking reader's knowledge?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. That's difficult. I mean, the poem that I read, Acrid Memory, that ends in just not for a fleeting moment was I purified. That's a very heavy word because it's a word that has been appropriated by the military to signify there's a doctrine in Israeli army military ideology, the purity of arms, that arms would not be used and that's taking the ritual purity from menstrual ritual to, you name it. That's a very heavy word, and it's using it in that, taking it over for the military, and this poem is attempting to take it back, to say that I was purified by having my face spit on. So it's hard to, it's hard to get all of that in there, even though the poem remains kind of still shocking in English. It's more shocking in Hebrew. So, I don't know, there are ways of, there are all kinds of different ways of doing that. There are ways of exaggerating, there are ways of referring, there are ways of multiplying. Sometimes you just can't do it. I mean, you have to do something else to convey what you're trying to convey. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could, thank you for reading that, was fantastic. I'm
Thank
wondering if you could possibly contextualize for us a little bit the last excerpt that you read from the Cairo notebooks. Where were you when you were writing this, and how did you, the imagery that you kind of sum it up, going from Tel Aviv, images of Saddam, Ayatollahs, and then going back to Zamalek. And can you put that into a context?
Well, I was living in Jerusalem and thinking that I was in the Middle East, which is usually not the case. And my communication, because of people that I was in touch with, was quite varied. I mean, in the sense that one of the dates are a little bit hazy, but there was what was called the camps war in Lebanon, in the refugee camps, was I was working with a group called the Palestine Human Rights Database and something called the Committee Confronting the Iron Fist, and I was also kind of following a figure, Faisal Husseini, who was constantly being put in administrative detention. And what would happen when he was put in administrative detention was whenever he would come out, we would see him and he would tell us stories about what he found out, because there are all kinds of prisoners who had disappeared in prisons, and he would get stories, and so we try to trace them. And during the camps war in Lebanon, of which I had friends who had relatives in those camps, and we were doing actions or demonstrations or vigils, or just to try to, you know, make people aware that this was happening, or just, you know, and there was sea piracy going on by the Israeli Navy. So they were taking people who were trying to bring food and medicine to Lebanon, or to just go and see what was happening, you know, from Cyprus or from wherever, and they were being captured at sea and put in Israeli prison. So we were getting these stories from prisoners that we could see every now and then. So the context was very, you know, somebody who had been, you know, you hear a story from somebody from Jerusalem who's just talked to somebody who was captured at sea, trying to go from Cyprus to Lebanon, etc. You know, the traffic of the people that I was involved in was very different. So the being where I was thinking about other places that you couldn't necessarily get to, but through which news was coming constantly. So I don't know if that helps.
Very, I think it
Yeah,
very much so.
yeah. And that was kind of the good old days. I mean, no, really. I mean, as opposed to the present or the last 10 years. I mean, the period of the first Intifada, 1987, was incredibly inspiring and hopeful, and really a kind of actual revolution, which was, you know, suppressed militarily and politically. So there you have it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
This is sort of for both of you. It seems like you both sort of take the personal and the political and the mythological, whether it's the sort of biblical Hebrew or Shelley's Revolt of Islam. And that seems to me like for most people that would be a very counterintuitive thing to do, taking these things and putting them together. What is their relationship for you? Why utilize this?
Why would you think that was counterintuitive?
We're like
Why is it
brothers here.
counterintuitive?
Why counterintuitive? We're like twins, you know?
Seems very, like, what
But
else
why-
would you
why
do?
do you-
I mean,
yeah.
no, but why would you say that?
Well, I guess I say that because I live in a culture where doing that seems pretty explosive, like it's not done regularly.
There's certainly, I mean, I can just go to where I teach, which is in Northern California. I mean, I live in San Francisco, but I teach in the community of Hayward. And, you know, these are working class students there who I think reflect a large part of the country, which is, you know, there is no personal in relation to political, in relation to mythological, and so on and so forth. For me, it's incredibly intuitive because I think, and it kind of relates to the un-Americanness, right, of what I'm thinking through, that I couldn't live any other way than to have a political reflection of what my personal life is. You know, it's almost like, you know, you grow up in a certain culture and they don't separate at all. You see what I'm saying? Like, particularly in Israel, when you grow up in Israel and you go back, it's like it's in your face all the time. You know, so is that what
There's a section in here that I didn't read where, you know, one of the big things in the context of people who are being killed politically is how you know, what happens, can you bury them, you know, publicly, okay? And in Palestine, it's a huge thing because the burials are suppressed. And a reference to that is you know, I have here 3 shot and killed at a roadblock. Faisal in for another 6 months. His wife and daughter visit once a week. Not to mention, more these days, not just Gaza. Army spokesman assure 4 dead the day before yesterday, 5 more yesterday, 16 wounded. Names? Helicopters tear gas hospital compound to disperse family members trying to seize corpse for burial. Blood donations not acceptable. More or less presentable leaders. Creon forbid Antigone to bury her brother because of the demonstration that would follow. Solon, besides institutionalizing the distinction between good women and whores, legislated against ostentatious funerals to curb the power of the aristocracy, not to mention the Trojan War. So, I mean, it was an immediate reference to Antigone, for instance, which, you know, is something that is brought up in amongst political prisoners in Morocco, for instance. There's an immediate reference like Brecht's Antigone because of the idea of Antigone wanting to bury her brother, but not being allowed to because it would be a political demonstration. So the idea of drawing on classics, or you know, is what are they actually saying, or what can they say? You know, what can they be made to say in different contexts? So again, for me, it's a very natural kind of reference point.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, Ammiel has mentioned this in his work, and I've mentioned it somewhat in my own work, but you know, in Palestine, it's common to see Palestinian writers, you know, referencing, you know, Native American works. Okay, so I mean, they're taking the lives that they lead as people who've been dispossessed, and not only personally relating to it, but going outside of it, you know, and seeing the relationship to other places as well. You can't help but do that. If you live in a situation of crisis, you can't really help but branch out and see where are the relationships, you know, that it just doesn't remain personally, you know, just a private matter, a personal matter. I don't know if that addresses what you're asking, but
yeah, I
mean,
think it's
it's
yeah.
like it's.
I mean, is there, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking, is that Mark? Mark?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mark?
Yeah.
Hi.
I'm just thinking, I'm looking at him, and I'm thinking of your book of on the coal mines. You know, I mean, how can, you know, it's the personal, political, the historical, the mythological. They're all there together. So it's, you know, it's pretty.
Susan, yeah.
I just wonder whether it might have something to do with the fact that in our moment now, and maybe not only, that so much of this gets sort of conveyed as information, you know, and you take it in as information, and then you sort of pass on to the next bit of information, right? Which means you're not engaging with it, really. You're just putting it aside for later engaging with it, maybe.
See, yeah, no, that's great. That's great. Part of the impetus to use these texts, you know, to use these words, like having Shelley's words, it's like, you know, it's kind of uncanny. You're recirculating those words in another economy, in another currency, okay, and they're getting a different life than the life that they have in his text, and so it's creating. You don't know what it's creating. It's kind of virus in some sense.
You know, for me to have made this discovery, I mean, I guess for the character to have made the discovery that the heart of Islam is American, right? It sounds like it's purely textual, right? But it has so much to do with my relationships with Khaled, for instance, with a friend of ours in Israel, and his family, his wife converting from Judaism to Islam, an American woman converting there. So it's all very personal. And then I start reading about from Muhammad Assad on the road to Mecca, and I find how, you know, what he thought of Islam and how the principles of Islam are not what we think of it in the common parlance. And then I think of Hannah Arendt and what she wrote on, you know, the politics of American Revolution. And I see these connections that all relate to my relationships with Khaled in Israel, you know, what we're talking about, you know. So it's this, you know, congruence, you know, and it's just perfectly natural. I mean, for me, it's not even There's no separation. It's like once the antenna is out there and stuff comes in, yeah.
Chuck, yeah.
There's something in the perennial possibility of analogy where there is no possibility of theoretical abstraction.
That's great.
So it's like analogy stands for understanding. Because I'm working with this now with work on the Iliad, and the whole thought of what is it that precedes the advent of Western conceptualization in the 5th century, and before even the pre-Socratics, where you have this poem in which the entire thing works on these extended similes, 12 lines, 20 lines of just as such and such, such and such and such and such. And there's no intellectuality in that poem at all, there's no thought. But there is a tremendous amount of intelligence working to cream these analogies. And it seems like that, when the Antigone thing just seems, hair stands on your neck to hear that.
And what we said earlier during the afternoon session where we were talking about translation, so we think about translation obviously as another form of analogy maybe, translation is a way of understanding through that, which is what you were talking about, as the real significance of translation is.
That it put analogy as opposed to metaphor, which contains that word transition, but it's like either a dishonest simile or a magic. And in magic, it's analogy.
Yeah, and then more possibilities. True.
I wasn't here with practicum earlier, so I don't know exactly what you touched on then. But if I can be a little reductive and say, if we think about politics as being decision-making, and translation as being a political act in a certain way, and very violent because of that, like, can either or both of you talk about the difficulty of translation in terms of it being a certain violence that some meaning is either impoverished or sometimes gained when you switch through languages, like when you talked about purification and how that word comes across a lot differently in translation, and especially when a lot of these poems that you've mentioned or even talked about or read have to deal with like a literal violence.
Well, I mean, I don't think of politics as decision-making. I mean, when Aristotle defines, man as a political animal, it's being social and how that social will be constructed. And I think of politics as also consciousness. How does one gain consciousness of the social and of relations? And so I don't see violence in translation necessarily. I mean, that assumes a kind of origin that is completely originary, and I think that's a difficult case to make with language because, language is a hybrid of coming from all kinds of elements, and I think that, I see translation as a much wider sphere that we're constantly involved in. As I said earlier today, whether we're translating visual, spatial, proprioceptive, linguistic register, emotion, memory, we're like translating machines, and language is just an instance of it. It's a more discrete instance of it, perhaps a more limited instance of it, I would think, of the total possibilities. So, there are those things that come up, but I don't necessarily see them that way. I see them more as transference, and not necessarily as violent. That's how I see it.
Although maybe the story of Olson's resignation from the Roosevelt administration tells a different story, one that might connect with what Griffin was saying.
So,
How do you mean? What?
His work
Uh-huh,
and why he left it
yeah.
perhaps taps into a kind of suspicion of politics as separated from the social, which seems to be where your question is coming from.
Oh, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, also separating himself from the administration. Yeah, for sure, for sure. But I think then, just
But, I mean-
to reinvent a different kind of politics, you know,
Yeah.
that, you know, that was more, as everyone in this, people in this room know, was more imaginary, more local, more, you know, understanding the ground where you're at, and the consciousness of that ground, and the landscape, and so on and so forth. So that's understanding the state of affairs, you know, polis.
I mean, I think to relegate politics to the realm of decision-making is to lose power, you know, is to lose a lot of power that can be gotten or gained. Obviously, if you are in a position of power, you know, there's going to be that much more of it, and there will be a lot of decision-making involved. But, you know, it also depends, I mean, the violence also is, it's very implicit and explicit in terms of what are you wielding, you know. I mean, if you're, you know, I talked about this earlier, if you're translating into American English, you're wielding can be a very blunt instrument, you know. And so one of the ways to think about translation is how do you create conditions in the work that will deflect that in some way, or at least bring it to consciousness, bring it to awareness that there's an imbalance maybe in these languages, or there's a power imbalance, so those things are you know, implicit problems always, I think, but I see them as, you know, occupying a much wider sphere of a lot of different activities. I don't know if that kind of
More
addresses
in relation to resistance. I mean, you know, Olson's famous line, you know, go the way of the lowest, go contrary, go sing, you know. I mean, that dissident resistance is a political move.
Yeah, cool.
Just out of curiosity, growing out of this question, so of course, if American English is understood as a blunt hegemonic instrument in many instances, have either of you ever encountered a work, I suppose this question could be asked of anyone in this room, that seemed as though it should not be translated into American English? That there was in some way a violation of its principle involved in bringing it over?
Well, you know, frankly, I mean, doing Sarajevo Blues was very risky in that sense, on a level of, I mean, I've talked about this numerous times. First of all, when I translated Sarajevo Blues, I translated kind of by consensus, because I asked friends and I asked people in Sarajevo what they felt needed to be translated, what was expressing what was going on. And, you know, when I got a hold of Sarajevo Blues, I asked people, is this, and universally everybody said, do this is it, you know, this is fine, this works for us, you know. Because so often people go into a situation and just lift something out of it. But at the same time, for Semezdin personally, this kind of also brought him to America, odd way. I mean, you know, if he had been embraced in France or in Germany or in Holland, maybe they would have moved there, you know, and not to America. And so, you know, bringing this work into the world that kind of created the situation that caused him to leave is really a problem, you know, and we were very aware of it while working on it. We're very aware of it, you know, which is very different than the phenomenon in Keys to the Garden, which was where it kind of created a community there, because the people were so isolated who were involved in this, they didn't know of each other. And I had to come in from outside to kind of make people aware of each other. And then I mean, when I was finishing this work, there were 24 writers in here. At the time, 22 of them were alive. And I did a calculation at some point where I realized that only about 10 of them were aware of other people who were in the, some of them knew of those people through political activities. They had no idea that they were writers. There was no space, there was no magazine, there was no public space, there was no point of discourse where they could engage with each other. So this thing kind of created a whole other thing, which it did not happen here. It stopped dead in its tracks here. There was no follow-up to this, believe me. There was no follow-up at all. It just hit, you know, that ideological wall of these people do not really exist. But it did have a real life there, which was very interesting. So, you know, I got a lot of people very, I don't know, upset, I guess, at some point where I went into this whole thing where I said, well, maybe, you know, maybe one shouldn't be translating, actually, you know, that it's actually feeding the beast, you know, and in fact, at a certain point, I was working on I was sitting in on a class at NYU taught by Elias Khoury on prison literature from the Arab world, and at some point we were reading a text by a guy named Faraj Bayraktar, who was a political prisoner in Syria for 11 years, and we were reading this manuscript, and at a certain point I suggested, why don't we just translate this as a group? And so we did, and we were at the point of actually trying to create a translators union to force, you know, an agenda, because really there were only, at that time, there were like half a dozen Arabic translators that were working professionally, and you know, you could create a work stoppage and say, look, no, we're not going to translate this. We want to translate this, this, and that, and X amount of royalties go to a fund so people in Syria can publish, or in Morocco can publish, or whatever. And you know, it just kind of ran out of steam. But I thought that was a great idea, you know, and one that could happen at some point, where you know, you wouldn't just be at the whim of the market, and you know, meandering in and out of whatever the fashion might be, you know. So yeah, I mean, it's something I think about a lot. I think there's a lot of things that shouldn't be translated. You know? But I think there's some things that really should be translated. I mean, as I said earlier in the day, a lot of the things that I've translated, I meant to translate as kind of direct interventions and challenges to writers here at the time. To say, well, okay, what were you thinking?
It's interesting.
This period.
You're kind of echoing what, I don't know who remembers this, but you're kind of echoing what Elliot Weinberger, the translator himself, said many, many years ago. I think it was in an issue of Sulfur, when you're talking about not translating, right? Where he said there's such a surplus of poetry around that we should, you know, pay certain poets not to write the way we pay certain farmers not to farm. You know? That kind of subsidy, you know, that of course, you know, you got hell for that, for saying that. But I guess the same would apply to a kind of parochialism in translation, and what texts get chosen and what texts don't get chosen.
Well, you know, we also have a very, I mean, so much of what gets translated in the U.S. is you know, reinscribes generic solidity. You know, we have books of poetry, and we have novels, and there's very little junk, you know, detritus, debates, letters, biographies, gossip. The terrain out of which things grow is hard to find, you know.
Well, the terrain has also been, as you all know, it's very specialized these days. You know, this book has given me some grief because I mean, everybody can use the word hybrid. I mean, they use it for cars these days, right? So you can use it for anything. But no one really knows how to frame it, how to shelve it, how to frame it. It says fiction on it, but it's as much, you know, a speculative lyric, a series of dialogues, a series of thought experiments. I mean, it's all this stuff. And basically what it is, it's a poetic kind of thinking, to my mind, you know, which is not framed in a way that can be shelved on some level. And so
You'll have to stay on the kitchen table.
whatever, yeah.
That is the situation of publishing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
it's
that has
definitely.
been for some time,
Yeah.
that everything goes on a special shelf. Right, it's
Or the
categorized.
kitchen table,
So,
Thank you, Ben and Ammiel.
There are books, many books.